Good evening. Welcome. I'm Don Hubin, the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, one of the sponsors of tonight's event. Tonight's event is the second annual Distinguished Lecture in Ethics for the Center for Ethics and Human Values, but we have a great many co-sponsors of tonight's event, including the Humanities Institute, which first brought our speaker tonight to our attention and made it possible for us to bring him to you. The Office of International Affairs, the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, the Honors and Scholars Program, the Department of Political Science, and the Glenn College have all contributed to this. In addition to our institutional co-sponsors, no event like this happens without the hard work of the people who actually organize the event. And so I want to thank Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer, Krista Johnson, and Steve Brown from the Center for Ethics and Human Values that did all that work to make this possible. We live in interesting times, politically, to be sure. Conventional wisdom about political matters is looking less and less like wisdom today. In countries around the world, so-called populist movements are challenging established political parties and destabilizing the political landscape. But what is populism? Is there a single phenomenon, populism, or are we lumping together significantly different movements with quite different motivations and aims? Tonight's speaker is going to help us understand these issues better, in part by putting them in a broader political context. Jan-Werner Müller studied at the Free University in Berlin, at University College London, St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and Princeton University. He's held positions at All Souls College, Oxford, at the European Studies Center at St. Anthony's College, and since 2005, he's been teaching in the politics department at Princeton University. If I were to list all of his publications, or even all of his major publications, we'd have little time to learn from Professor Müller. So I'm not going to do that. Let me mention just a few that are particularly relevant to tonight's topic. In 2007, he published a book called Constitutional Patriotism. It was published in 6 languages. You're going to see a trajectory here on the number of languages the books are translated into. In 2011, he published A History of Political Thought in 20th Century Europe, Contesting Democracy, which has been translated into at least 11 languages. And his 2016 book, Was ist Populismus? I will try to say in German, What is Populism? Has been, or is scheduled to be published in more than 22 languages, something that indicates the global significance of the topic we're going to be looking at tonight. In addition to his academic books and articles, he's also contributed to the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books Daily, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, and several other popular publications. Please join me in welcoming Jan-Werner Müller to talk to us about what is populism.
Thank you, Don, for the kind and also mercifully short introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, our era is characterized by an absolutely inflationary use of the word populism. All kinds of actors, from right to left, have been labeled as populists in our days. Last year, even poor Emmanuel Macron, at one point, was charged with being a populist. During the French presidential campaign, it was said that he was a populist of the extreme center. Whatever the hell that was supposed to mean. Moreover, you basically cannot open a newspaper, go on the internet, or watch television without encountering one particular image which is supposed to explain or encapsulate at least the major trend of our times. I'm talking about the image of the supposedly unstoppable wave of populism, or as Nigel Farage, for whom apparently the wave was too petty, too small an image, put it, the tsunami of populism, which, to stick with a metaphor, is now supposed to wash away elites and the establishment everywhere. Now, I believe that this image is actually profoundly misleading, But before trying to convince you that it is profoundly misleading and trying to capture what is really going on in our days, I would first like to offer you a kind of basic understanding of what I take populism actually to be. That'll be the first chapter of my remarks tonight. Secondly, I want to say a few words about what populists do when they are in power, especially in light of the, I think, still very widespread view that virtually by definition populists cannot really govern because, it's often said, they're essentially all protest movements, and logically, once you are in power, you cannot keep protesting against yourself. I want to convince you that this expectation that populism cannot really govern is profoundly wrong. And then lastly, also by way of trying to open up a discussion for us tonight, I'll say a few words about what can possibly be done. But that's a long story, and I don't want to pretend that it can be said, in a couple of convenient 3 or 4 bullet points. It's more by way of trying to open up a debate for us here tonight. So, first chapter. What is populism anyway? The conventional wisdom of our time, of course, is that populists are those who attack, criticize, rise up against the establishment or the elites. When you really think about this, it's actually a very strange thought. Up until quite recently, I believe, any old civics textbook would have told you that it's actually a sign of good civic/democratic engagement that people keep a close eye on the powerful, be it in politics, be it in economics, be it in culture, God forbid even universities. It was by no means obvious that actually keeping an eye on the powerful was going to make you somehow a populist who might be dangerous for democracy. So this can't be quite right. Now it's true that when populists are in opposition, they criticize those who are in power. But they also, above all else, do something else. In one way or another, populists always claim that they, and only they, represent what populists typically refer to as the real people, or also very often as the silent majority. Now, at first sight, that might not sound so terrible. This is not obviously, let's say, the same as racism. It's not the same as, let's say, in the European context, a fanatical hatred of the European Union, or anything of that sort. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that this stance is always bound to have 2 consequences which are detrimental for any democracy. First, populists are also going to then claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this is never just a disagreement about policy, or for that matter, a disagreement about values, which is completely normal in a democracy and ideally also productive. No, populists in a certain way almost immediately make it moral, and they make it personal, along the lines of suggesting that the others, the other contenders for power, are simply corrupt, or to coin a phrase, crooked characters. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are then also going to claim that all citizens, all, if you like, those among the people themselves who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of a supposedly real people, and who hence then logically also do not support populists politically, that with all those citizens, you can basically put their membership in the people under suspicion or in question. Let me try to illustrate this maybe less obvious point with 2 examples. Many of you will probably remember the words of Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, that he uttered at the very end of that memorable, for many people no doubt, traumatic night of Brexit. He said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people, suggesting, of course, that the 48% of Brits who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real, might not truly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, specifically the English people. Or an example from this side of the Atlantic. In an otherwise little remarked upon speech in May 2016, the person who nowadays occupies the White House said, I'm quoting more or less from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything. I hope you can see where this is going. It's the populist who decides who truly belongs to the people. And whether you happen to have an American passport, whether you happen to belong legally in that symbolic construction, is not really an important question at all. So long story short, what I'm trying to make plausible to you is the thought that what matters about populism is not some vague anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize elites. Doesn't mean we're right, but this is not in and of itself something that possibly will pose a danger for democracy. What matters about populism, and what does pose the danger, is anti-pluralism. The tendency of populists always to exclude others at the level of party politics, other politicians, and, less obviously, at the level of citizens and the people themselves. If I may, let me draw out two implications of this view that might be helpful in opening up a larger discussion about democracy. First of all, if you find anything plausible at all in what I've been trying to get across to you so far, you might say, don't populists who actually don't get into power, who lose elections, or for that matter, who don't win overwhelming majorities at the polls, don't they have a pretty big problem, an almost logical problem? For how can it be that on the one hand, we the populists, we and only we, represent the real people, and on the other hand, we're not in power? That can't really be the case. Very often, not always, I hasten to add, but very often, if populists face a situation like this, when they've basically lost an election, they will tend to take a second look at that famous or maybe infamous expression, the silent majority. By their own definition, if the majority weren't silent, they would always already be in power. So this thought then suggests itself that maybe we're not really talking about a silent majority. Maybe we are talking about a silenced majority. In other words, in many cases, again I hasten to emphasize not always, in many cases, populists who lose are basically going to suggest that it was rigged, that elites behind the scenes must have done something to prevent the majority from truly expressing itself. And I think I don't need to remind you of November 2016 when Trump said, well, if I'm going to accept her victory, I'll tell you at the time. His supporters, or at least according to some polls, 70% of them understood exactly what he was trying to express. According to one survey at the time, 70% of Trump supporters said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. Now that kind of number, I think, is bad news for any democracy. Because what it also shows is that populists, even if they don't get into power ultimately, will constantly suggest to their followers that there's something profoundly wrong with our democracy, that maybe everything is a facade, that everything is being rigged. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we're not allowed to criticize our existing institutions, especially but not only in this country. Plenty of things to criticize, from campaign finance to gerrymandering. I don't need to remind you of all the pathologies in our democracy today. But there's a difference, I believe, between somebody who makes these criticisms and then invites others to basically debate them, share them, maybe mobilize around them, and on the other hand, somebody who says, because I didn't win, it must have been rigged. The latter stance is not really a democratic one. The other implication that maybe is worth drawing out responds to something that maybe also some of you might be tempted to think. It's the thought that, yes, all right, these populists, their rhetoric is really uncouth. What they say about the other competitors for power really, kind of breaks some taboos, isn't terribly nice. But still, couldn't it be the case that they ultimately perform a kind of useful role in serving as a corrective and ultimately also help to bring people closer again to the existing liberal democratic institutions? I roundly reject that suggestion. Because when one takes a closer look, the real way in which populists always operate is bound to be something like the following. First step, basically work out a symbolic construction of the allegedly real people. Second step, deduce from that construction a supposedly singular authentic will of the real people. And then third step, say that I am your voice. Now notice that in this entire process, nobody else has really spoken. It's been an entirely theoretical construction. And if you perhaps were to push me and say, but look, isn't it at least still true that very often, at least in some countries, populists call for referenda, for something like plebiscites, for some kind of, involvement of the people themselves directly? I think it's important to see that referenda can mean very different things for different actors. Populists, in a certain way, always already know the correct answer which the people are supposed to give, because they've deduced it from their symbolic construction of the real people. The job of the people is basically just to tick the right box. And that, I think, is profoundly different from somebody who says, okay, let's have a referendum, let people speak, but let's treat this as basically an open-ended process, where we don't know in advance what people are going to say. We don't know in advance, how ultimately they're going to judge once they've listened to other people, once they've listened to experts, once they've listened to a certain amount of representatives, and so on. So in that sense, I think populism is not the answer to any sort of deficits in our democracies when it comes to more involvement by citizens. All right, allow me to open the second chapter of my remarks tonight. Populism in power. As hinted at earlier, there are plenty of people, liberals both in the narrow and also in the wider sense, who indeed tend to assume that almost by definition these actors cannot really govern. They're all protest movements. Once you're in power, you cannot keep protesting against yourself. Or, variation of this thought, they're all anti-elitists. Once you're in government, you yourself have become the elite, and you can't keep protesting against elites. Or, slightly different argument, but also very widespread, these populists, they all have these horrendously simplistic ideas about policy. And once they get into power, it's going to be blindingly obvious on day 2 of their administration that nothing really works in practice. The walls aren't getting built, the trade agreements aren't being renegotiated. It's going to be completely clear to everybody around that their promises aren't being fulfilled. And then either, they will just objectively fail, or maybe the office will ultimately exert some moderating influence on them. You can see that all these widespread views come down to the same conclusion. The problem will solve itself, one way or the other. Either they moderate or they fail so catastrophically that basically we don't have to worry too much. Well, alas, my message tonight to you, maybe not the one you came for, is that no, we do have to worry. It's simply not true that populists cannot govern. And more importantly, it's simply not true that populists cannot govern as populists. We have plenty of examples in our day from, to name just a couple of the obvious cases, from Hungary to Turkey to Venezuela to Poland, maybe to some degree to India, and perhaps to some degree here, where it's become very clear that populists can govern specifically as populists, by which I mean as actors who on one level do not accept the legitimacy of an opposition. As actors who, whenever they're being criticized, for instance, by independent, non-elected actors such as judges or journalists, are going to shoot back by saying, we're elected, you're not, and by the way, we and only we represent the people. We've seen this kind of rhetoric in all the countries I mentioned a minute ago. And that, I dare say, is actually fairly obvious. What perhaps is not obvious, and in a certain way maybe even more unsettling, is that we've also gradually seen the emergence of something that perhaps rather perversely you might call a populist art of governance. A kind of approach that has a certain internal coherence and that also tends to exhibit similar characteristics. Now, I don't mean to suggest that all these countries, all these regimes are exactly the same. They're not. There are important differences. And yet, when you look at them all together, I think you're bound to say it's kind of one family. And in the family, people tend to do similar things. What do I mean? Let me pick out three elements from this populist art of governance. First, it's very typical that populist governments will essentially try to appropriate the state itself for them. More concretely, less abstractly put, what in theory at least should be a kind of neutral bureaucracy or civil service is systematically politicized. Neutral people are being replaced with partisan actors from the governing party. Now, some of you might come back to me and say, well, actually plenty of parties try to do that if given the chance. You know, this is not specifically populist really, is it? True, but I think there's a difference between people who kind of try to do this in a kind of shamefaced, ideally hidden way, and populists who, remember, from the get-go say, we and only we represent the people. And then in a second step, surely the state is there for the people. So there's nothing wrong with us appropriating the state. In fact, that's what it would mean for the state to serve the people. So that's one element. A second element that I think is very typical is that these governments, these regimes, if you like, tend to engage in something that political scientists, with a rather highfalutin term, tend to refer to as mass clientelism, which is just another way of saying that benefits, or maybe sometimes bureaucratic favors, should go to those who support the governing party. Now again, some of you might be tempted to say, well look, plenty of parties try to do that. In fact, it's not even so obviously undemocratic that parties which have been elected then do something for those people who elected them. Quite normal. Yes, to some degree. But again, there's a difference between those who don't really want to make this all too obvious and populists, where, remember from the get-go, the assumption is that not all citizens are actually part of the people. Only some people are the real people. And the fact that then benefits and bureaucratic favors only go to those who are the real people and everybody else gets nothing is not something to be ashamed of. That's actually how things should be. Now, if I may add a footnote to this thought, perhaps this kind of practice, if you like, this kind of element of this populist art of governance might explain something which otherwise is deeply puzzling. I'm referring to the fact that very often, of course, populists initially say, elect us, we're not corrupt, the elites are corrupt, we are here to drain you know what. And then, at least in some prominent cases, it turns out that these people, once they're in government, are 10 times as corrupt as, those who were thrown out. And as a kind of naive observer, you would have thought, politically, this must be deadly. If you think, for instance, of cases like the Freedom Party in Austria, where they still, even long time after Jörg Haider died, have basically lawsuits and big legal problems and huge debts because of corruption. Think of Turkey as a possible example in this context. Maybe you can think of other contexts in this regard. One would have thought that any sign of anything that could smell like corruption must be an enormous problem for these sorts of actors. Well, one hypothesis, and I underline hypothesis, it's not something I can prove to you empirically right here and right now, but one hypothesis would be to say that from the point of view of their supporters, this doesn't look like a sort of illegitimate clientelism. It doesn't look like corruption. They are doing it for us. And at the most, if they get a little bit out of it as well, that's actually okay. Now, that's only one hypothesis. There's another one that perhaps is worth debating later on when we have a chance, which perhaps you might say is a more obvious explanation. The more obvious explanation would be that, at least in some of the cases mentioned earlier on, media pluralism has been radically reduced by the parties in power. So we, I think, very often, of course, still tend to assume that, all right, we look around the world and we can assume that everybody else kind of roughly knows what we know. But of course, in many of these contexts, that's not a given. So if you also think of a particular Danish fairy tale that a lot of us love, we still tend to deep down believe that it will just take one child to point out that the emperor is actually naked and the show is over. But Andersen's tale, of course, assumes that everybody can hear the child. And in a world where not everybody can hear the child, this assumption that basically once it's been pointed out, once it's become known, the show is going to be over, that assumption can no longer be taken for granted. Allow me to suggest to you one last element of this populist art of governance. When there is protest against populist government/regimes, when there are people out there demonstrating, civil society rising up, it becomes supremely important for these governments to discredit that protest as comprehensively as possible, even if, in many cases, the protest doesn't really seem to pose any genuine threat to their power. It still is very important for them to basically discredit protests morally and symbolically. Think of somebody who, I think, in a certain way pioneered what turned out to be the most obvious first-to-hand strategy in terms of this project of discrediting protest. Vladimir Putin. He was arguably the first one to tell people, look, what you think is genuine civil society protest out there is, of course, actually all steered by, financed by, and then, a usual sort of set of suspects is trotted out. It's the CIA, it's George Soros. There are no limits to creativity here. So if you may remember the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul in 2013, what did the government say? These are not ordinary or even real Turkish citizens. No. It was obvious for them that everything had, of course, been organized by Lufthansa, the German airline, because Erdogan had just built this fantastic new airport close to Istanbul, and Turkish Airlines, was now going to overtake Lufthansa. Plus, Morgan Freeman keeps telling us it's such a fantastic airline. So they were very worried, and that's why they staged this entire fake protest against the government. I hope you can see why, on the basis of this initial description of what populism is all about, how on the basis of that description it becomes comprehensible why they need to do it, even if the protest isn't a real threat to their power. Because by definition, again, it cannot be true that parts of the people themselves are protesting against their only legitimate representatives. That cannot really be happening in the kind of populist universe. And hence it's so important to discredit that protest. Now, there's a twist, I think, to this last point that I want to put on the table as well. And if I may, I'll try to get us into a discussion of that twist with a small visual example, which requires me to hit one button, which is still a kind of demanding thing for somebody like me to do. But if I manage, then I simply am going to ask you, no, don't worry about the words. Don't worry about what is being said here in this clip. Just please pay attention to the kind of dramaturgy, the kind of story that is being told here if I manage to hit the button.
processus par le coup ou par la crainte. Je m'intéresse des mots de Bernanos. L'espérance est un risque à courir. Vive la République! Vive le peuple! Et vive la France!
Allow me to just mention one or two words about the context of what we just saw. This video depicts a ritual that actually doesn't exist anymore in this form. This was about the annual laying down of a wreath at the statue of Joan of Arc in the first district of Paris by the French National Front. 2015 is the last time this ever happened in this form, because the Front National announced later that year that it was now too dangerous to do this because of terrorism, and that instead they were going to have a banquet somewhere inside. One observation as a footnote to this context, of course you might then say, isn't it interesting that we never see the statue of Joan of Arc? But of course on one level it's obvious why. Because we have our own Joan of Arc right here in the middle of the picture. Anyway, the reason I showed you this is about another element of the story. You will all have realized that about 2/3 of the way through, something very incongruous happens. It's when these half-naked, sorry, I didn't know there were kids in the audience here tonight, when these half-naked women appear on the balcony with these big banners saying Heil Le Pen. This really happened. As many of you probably have guessed, these were activists, protesters from Femen who staged this protest against Marine Le Pen. And of course the interesting thing is that the official video doesn't deny that this happened. What it doesn't show, to be sure, is how the protest was actually put down. So it was much more brutal than what you see here. The security forces of the FM pulled their hair, kind of choked them, really bad stuff. But irrespective of that, the interesting thing is that basically the protest is not denied, but rather, that's my suggestion to you, the protest is being incorporated into a larger narrative, and as always with populists, it's a larger narrative of culture war. Culture war, I would suggest to you, is ultimately their business model, and in a perverse way, something like this can, if you don't mind the expression, serve their business, because it helps them to underline time and time again that here are we the real people, and there are those who do not truly belong, or who basically make themselves visible and recognizable as profoundly other. And more specifically, of course, this is not just in general about the real French people. It's also, I believe, a particular kind of contrast, because if you just were to watch this as a completely innocent observer of France, and then somebody asks you, so the National Front, what is that really about? I dare say that innocent observer would say, you know, the French National Front, that's a party of young women who defend classic Republican with a small r French values of liberty, equality, and, well, fraternity maybe doesn't quite work so well, but that's the point. And the particular twist then is that it's really a competition or war of two feminisms. It's the crazy Femen feminism, and it's basically the healthy Republican with a small r French feminism that is so much foregrounded in this self-presentation here. So why am I going on about this? I'm going on about this because I think in many recent cases when people have talked about the need for protest, the need for resistance, I think they maybe have sometimes insufficiently taken note of the fact that in this perverse way, under certain conditions, the protest, the resistance might be instrumentalized by those that they are trying to protest against. And that at the very least, one has to be ready with a way to combat that effort to incorporate protest into a larger culture war narrative. I wouldn't go quite so far as Steve Bannon, who you remember famously said, the resistance is our friend. It ain't as simple as that, but there is a thought in there that I think needs to be taken seriously. All right, if I may, I'll add a couple of words about the question, what is to be done? And if I may, I'll approach that question, first of all, in a more roundabout negative way, and basically rephrase it as what is not to be done, in light of what at least I see as some very typical reactions to populist forces in the world today. It's become very typical for other political actors essentially to say, okay, you populists, we try to exclude you as much as we possibly can. Certainly no coalitions in countries where in democracies you tend to have coalitions, but even, we're not going to appear on a podium with you, we're not going to have a discussion with you. We exclude you and thereby underline just how much we object to you. Now this stance, I think, is a profound mistake, both on a, if you like, strategic level, but also on a kind of normative level. It's, I think, very obviously a mistake on a strategic level, because you are doing populists a huge favor by confirming the very narrative which they are always presenting to their followers. The elites never listen, they don't care about you, they're so afraid of us that, they don't even talk to us, there are all these taboo subjects that nobody dares to talk about, we are the only ones who do, and so on. So it works perfectly for them on that strategic level. But even on a, if you like, more normative/moral level in a democracy, it strikes me as highly problematic in cases where populist parties already have representatives in, let's say, parliaments or Congress or so, to basically exclude them altogether. Because what you end up doing de facto is to deny representation to all citizens who elected them. And I think we must not make the mistake of assuming that all those who vote for populist actors are necessarily populists themselves. So the leaders tell us what they're about. I think they display their anti-pluralism. But it would be a big mistake to then jump to the conclusion that, yes, all citizens who vote for them must also be committed to some kind of anti-pluralism. In many cases, at least, at the very least, we can't know for sure. It's not too fanciful, even though maybe it's a bad example, to imagine somebody in France who says, all that rhetoric by Marine Le Pen about the other politicians being corrupt and giving each other 10,000 euro Armani suits, I don't really care all that much about that. But she just has this fantastic agricultural policy, which really works for me, and that's why I'm voting for her. And that person is then basically de facto denied standing in a democracy where other politicians exclude these sorts of representatives entirely. Furthermore, just as a footnote, if I may, you might also say there is something profoundly contradictory about a stance that comes down to saying, because you morally exclude others, we will now morally exclude you. I think in the eyes of many observers, there's something not quite right about adopting that particular stance. However, there's also been a tendency to basically go from this extreme to another extreme. And the other extreme has very often been a kind of move where people switch from saying populists, all demagogues, all liars, all morally unacceptable, where they switch from that position to one where they tend to say, well, maybe populists know something about, as the cliched phrase then tends to go, people's real concerns and anxieties. They know something about what is going on deep down in our societies that somehow all so-called mainstream establishment, etc., politicians and parties have missed. So all of a sudden those who do that give them a kind of sociological monopoly of really understanding what is going on. And then it's usually just one more step towards saying, well, maybe we could have a coalition, or we could do something together. And again, I think this is a mistake both on a strategic, or if you like, instrumental level, and a mistake on a moral level. It's a mistake on a strategic level because, as many politicians, especially in Europe, have discovered, no matter how fast you run after some of these actors, you're never going to catch them. And the more you try to copy them in certain ways by saying, yes, they've told us what people's real grievances are, and now we talk like them, the more these populists are going to say, look, they're just copying us. And by the way, we're the original, and the original remains on the ballot. So why don't you vote for the original? Furthermore, and maybe less obviously, in some countries where this has happened big time, think of Denmark, the Netherlands, where basically nominally center-right mainstream parties have run after populists, the end result has usually been that an entire political spectrum has shifted, in this case, to the right, which is not in and of itself undemocratic. What arguably is problematic is that a lot of this has happened without anything that resembles a comprehensive democratic authorization, because many people were just voting for their normal mainstream party. They didn't vote for super restrictive immigration necessarily. So we see outcomes that then a couple of years later, very often behind closed doors, some people might say nobody really wanted, but once you have them, they're very hard to reverse. That's all just the strategic level. On the moral level again, I think it's very important to recognize that all this cliche talk about legitimate grievances and, they finally brought to our attention what people's real anxieties are and so on and so forth, on one level rests on a profound misunderstanding of how democratic representation really works. This kind of argument essentially suggests that democratic representation is like a sort of mechanical reproduction of always already existing identities and interests. And finally the populists make it visible, that was always already there. When in fact, I would put to you, democratic representation is a dynamic process where even people's most basic perceptions of who they are and what their interests are profoundly shaped by the kind of offerings they get, to be sure, from politicians, but also from the media, but also from friends and family, and where it's much, much more difficult to think that we can have a single profound truth about our society. Let me give you a maybe slightly unsavory example. November 9th, 2016. Europe wakes up. Everybody says catastrophe. It's the end of the world. But then, maybe to make themselves feel a little bit better, they indulge a sentiment which, as far as I know, is always said to only have a German word for it: Schadenfreude. And the particular version of Schadenfreude, that one got the sense of what was going on, was basically people saying, the Americans, we always knew, they're all racists. And now they've proven it to us. They've proven that at least 63 million of them are profoundly racist. I'm not suggesting there are no racists in this country, but the assumption that basically Trump told us the final truth about American society, because we can so easily infer that, this was really his voters' deepest interest, or let's say ideational commitment, I think works with this incorrect understanding of democratic representation. All right, by now I can imagine plenty of you getting impatient, saying, okay, this is negative and you shouldn't do that. Can you maybe tell us something more positive, by way of concluding this exercise? Yes, but it's something quite modest in a certain way. It comes down to the following thought. It comes down to the thought that in a democracy there are plenty of issues where people can legitimately disagree. Questions to do with the economy, but maybe more controversially, questions to do with immigration, for instance. Now, right-wing populists, of course, are going to say, we want to reduce immigration as much as possible. Not the stance I would adopt, maybe not the stance that plenty of you in this room here tonight would adopt. But I think it's a mistake if one simply then responds and says, oh, that's automatically undemocratic. No, I think the demand on, if you like, normal politicians under those circumstances has to be that they should fight with the best arguments they have, fight even with the best emotional appeals they have, and just hope that their side is going to win. So far, so obvious, maybe so banal. What perhaps is less banal is the thought that in those moments, when then a populist actor reveals herself or himself specifically as a populist, it's supremely important that other, if you like, normal politicians mark that moment and push back as strongly as possible. Example, if a populist politician says there's a secret plan by Angela Merkel to replace the German people with Syrians, this is a real-world example, as some of you may recognize, it's very important that other people don't sit around and say, oh, that's another interesting contribution to the debate about refugees. No, it's absolutely important to then be as tough as possible and to mark the red line of what is sayable and what is not sayable in a democracy. Now, you may come back to me and say, well, okay, but you know what? The populist politician is not going to recline and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was propounding a conspiracy theory. I won't do it again. But it's not about him. It's about citizens watching this and perhaps it's the pious hope from a democratic theorist, saying to themselves, I might agree with these people on certain substantive issues, but you know, the fact that they constantly keep telling me that everything is a facade, that everything is rigged, that everything is about secret plans, maybe I don't necessarily want to be in the same boat with these kinds of attitudes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, relates to the very, very last thought I want to put out for you tonight. Goes back to what I hinted at the very beginning. Why is the image of the wave, the tsunami, or as Steve Bannon put it recently on his, well, I was going to say victory tour, but I guess not quite. Anyway, his tour of Europe, when he went to Italy and so on, Switzerland and so on. Why is this image so wrong? Well, in a nutshell, with all due respect, Nigel Farage did not bring about Brexit all by himself, even though Brexit is usually trotted out as the #1 example of, you know, the first great populist triumph. He didn't do it by himself. He needed his very established, conservative, and I use that word consciously, collaborators. People who were basically ready to say that, yes, you know, Farage is a bit eccentric, but the case for Brexit is sensible and sound. People like well, maybe not Boris Johnson, but people like, if you recall, Michael Gove, the distinguished Tory politician who went on British television in the spring of 2016 and when confronted with the fact that basically all experts said Brexit was a bad idea, famously said, this country has had enough of experts. And what mattered, I think, in this particular context, is that Michael Gove clearly has always been perceived as an intellectual, dare I say, an expert in the Tory party. It wasn't just any person from the street who wandered in and convinced people that actually expertise was overrated. No, it took an expert to convince people that expertise was overrated. In this country, at the risk of reminding you of the obvious and maybe the painful, Donald Trump did not become president as the candidate of a new grassroots movement of, as the cliche goes, the angry white working class. No, he was the candidate of a very established party. And he also needed, no pun intended, the support and the blessing of heavyweights like Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, and Newt Gingrich, who basically told Republicans, yes, he might be a bit strange in certain ways, but ultimately he is our candidate. And again, it might not be entirely irrelevant to remind ourselves of a moment in the summer of 2016 when Gingrich was on CNN during the time of the convention and said, you know, crime is going through the roof, you know, this is why we have to elect Trump. And then the CNN reporter said, but look, these statistics from the FBI show the opposite. To which, I'm quoting from memory, Gingrich basically responded, you may believe in what theorists say. I mean, in those days, people had, you know, different worries about the FBI than they have about it now. Anyway, for us still, it was a surprise at that point that the FBI allegedly is full of theorists and philosophers. But Gingrich basically said, you may believe in what theorists say, I believe in what people feel. And again, I put it to you that it was not irrelevant that it was Gingrich who made this claim. Because whatever else you think about him, he is somebody who is also perceived as a kind of intellectual in the context of the American conservative movement. A history professor, somebody who writes books, both about the past and about the future. Not just anybody who walked in from the street and said, oh, you know, expertise is overrated, just trust your gut. No, it was a particular kind of person. And this is, you know, again, maybe too obvious to even remind ourselves of, on one level, 2016 was a very normal election. More than 90% of self-identified Republicans voted for their party. And in most elections, people vote for their party. Whether we had a normal candidate or not is another question. Now, the reason this is all worth reminding ourselves of, I think, is that up until this point, up until this moment, up until today, nowhere in Western Europe, or North America for that matter, has a right-wing populist come to power without the collaboration of established conservative elites. In all those countries where established conservative parties opted not to support a right-wing populist, example, the Austrian presidential election 2016, they did not win. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why the image of the supposedly unstoppable wave, as if it were a kind of act of nature or, God forbid, even an act of God, is so misleading. It basically doesn't see this kind of agency, it doesn't see the enablers, it doesn't see the fact that we're wrong just to remain totally fixated just on the populists, as if it was all about them, and as if they had so much attractiveness and power that, now they're basically unstoppable. No. We need to also keep an eye on the other actors. And this is not just the left-right. I'm not saying it's all a worry about just the right. It's also a worry on the left. So we should get away from what I think has become a very strong tendency now with every single election, be it in this country, be it in Europe, or for the matter, be it anywhere else around the globe, only ever to ask one question, which is, oh, populist up or populist down? No, it ain't that simple. And like all academic talks, the conclusion is always, it ain't that simple. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
So if you have questions for Professor Müller, please line up behind one of the microphones on either side, either of the aisles here, and we will have a question and answer period for approximately half an hour. After that, there will be a reception outside, just outside the theater here. So please join us for reception for Professor Müller then. And Professor Müller will field his questions here.
Please.
I enjoyed your talk very much. Thank you. Can you speak for a moment about the context of populism vis-a-vis the Electoral College? So on the one side, we hear one man, one vote. The other side, we hear we eliminate the tyranny of the majority. And in fact, you mentioned Democratic representation, but in fact, Hillary Clinton got more votes. So can you talk about that?
If I may, I'll just say two things. One is that the perception, well, perception is the wrong word, the argument, no, argument is also the wrong word, the theory, the claim, let's say, the claim that actually, no, she didn't get more votes. Okay? Remember all these illegals who cast votes and so on? I think hopefully you can see why this fits into the story. For why even somebody who could have said, look, it doesn't matter, these are the rules, it's fine, as a populist, cannot really say or cannot really live with the idea that actually a majority kind of actually was against him. So again, symbolically on a certain level, morally, it's supremely important to persist with that story, even though, many observers may have at this point said, move on, it's really not that important anymore. You are there, okay? Relax. From within that sort of universe of how you imagine your relationship to the people, it is very important that, what seemed to have been true can't possibly be really true. Now, there's a long discussion to be had about the Electoral College, about, the quality of representativeness, if you like, of this democracy. It's not just the Electoral College. I mentioned some of the obvious issues earlier on, such as gerrymandering, campaign finance. I think it's important to not make the mistake of presenting a case against populism such that it then looks like a defense of the status quo. And sometimes that can happen. People sort of, argue, and then, in a sense, there's a reasonable counterclaim where people say, but look, we have all these problems, and populists are right to point at some of these problems, and there are deep flaws in the kind of democratic politics we have. So, again, this is a very maybe pious academic hope, but I think the ideal case involves both sides. And on the one hand, both is very clear about the short-term danger. and doesn't sort of minimize this along the lines of saying, oh, but there are also all these other problems, it's typical sort of mainstream liberal who will now be very happy because, they can rest content that now there's one fascist and now we fight the good fight and everything is clear, and they forget about all these larger structural problems. It's important in a sense to do both at the same time. And I'm aware that I haven't really answered your question at all, but I hope I've said a couple of other interesting things in the process. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thanks for a really fascinating presentation. I guess one sense that I have is that, and I guess this isn't a question, but maybe just a thought, is that this populism also represents political marketing taken to its sort of absolute extreme. That is, we can win elections based on anti-democratic sentiments and basically appealing to, insider, outsider concerns, emotional concerns, all the things that are, and these taboo topics that you're all thinking, but no, you're not supposed to talk about. And I just wonder if there's a way to counter this as a political strategy or as a form of marketing that will continue to draw people to it.
So let me give you a very clear answer to what you said wasn't really going to be a question, but I think actually fortunately was a question in a certain way. The very clear answer is yes and no. So yes, in the sense that a lot of these populist actors, and especially also the governments staffed by populists, are certainly learning from each other. And they are in a certain way copying best, or you might say, worst practices. And I think that's worth pointing out, because again, I think deep down today, many people hold on to the thought that yes, democracies, we make mistakes all the time, but we are the only learning system. We are the only self-correcting system. And basically the authoritarians are stupid, and they're all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991, because they can't adapt, they can't learn, they can't admit mistakes, and so on. And again, I think one of the maybe great disillusionments of our age has been the realization that no, a lot of these actors are constantly learning. And they're getting very good, for instance, at basically fooling the EU in terms of, no, this is still a real democracy, what's there not to like? Because they've learned how to game the Freedom House indicators, they've learned how to influence the international press in certain ways. So I think the realization that, yes, these are techniques or practices in a certain way that can travel and that can be successfully copied, I think is an important one. Furthermore, I think it's also true, although it's not quite the same as marketing, but it's sort of in this area. It's important to, I think, be clear on what certain technology has done for populism, which is not to fall into the kind of mistake of technological determinism, that, populism was given to us by Facebook and Twitter and there can't really be anything else. I think that's clearly wrong. But it's still worth trying to figure out if there might sometimes be at least a connection such that certain types of populist practices are made at least somewhat easier by certain new forms of technology. And what I have in mind, and this will not at all surprise you, of course, is the capacity of certain actors to use blogs, or in particular Twitter, in such a way as to make the suggestion to their various audiences that there can be something like a direct connection between them and the citizen, which is, I think, also a kind of arch-populist element. It's not completely new. In the old days, you could have, for instance, gone to a 5-hour party meeting, and up there in front was your uniquely authentic representative. But that's different from the world we live in now, where it's basically a sort of a matter of a 24/7 lived experience. I wake up at 3 a.m., I look at Trump's tweets, I say, oh great, just what I was thinking. Probably more the other way around, but it doesn't matter. It's this suggestion of a direct link that we have there. And that we also, for instance, had very strongly with a figure like Beppe Grillo in Italy. Remember, Grillo basically told his supporters that it's not just the professional politicians who are corrupt. It's also always the professional journalists. Because in his mind, mediation is always bound to be some form of distortion. And then he famously, again I'm quoting from memory, said, folks, it works like this. You tell me what's going on via his blog, and then I play the amplifier. By now, people in Italy have figured out that maybe it's not quite as simple as that, but the suggestiveness of this idea, I think, is very strong. And conceptually, it goes easily, not necessarily, but easily, with a certain kind of anti-pluralism. Because what you're essentially saying is that there don't be any other voices in this direct relationship. And we don't need mediation, because the will of the people should be obvious for everybody to see. And we don't need to have boring intra-party discussions which are going to take too many evenings, because the will of the people is clear for all to see. Why have a debate about this? So anti-pluralism, I think, is connected to this sort of suggestion of a direct link. And I think one of the prime challenges for, I guess, all of us is to somehow find ways to kind of get other voices into that seemingly sealed off, hermetic space where it's just basically the leader in a relationship of what you might call, in the words of the Italian political theorist Nadia Urbinati, a form of direct representation. So it's not really participation by citizens, but it's a sort of representation where you've cut out the middlemen and the middlewomen. And once you've done that, you've also cut out all the other voices that could have been in that conversation. Now here's very briefly the no part. The one thing I wouldn't agree with is that, oh well, we have all these anti-democratic sentiments out there waiting to be articulated by populists. And it sort of suggests that we could know for sure that yes, people are dying to, say xenophobic things, and this is going to be the winning strategy because that's what people really believe. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't nothing like there's nothing like that out there. That would be foolish. But the idea that that is our moment, that is the wave, that is now so deeply in the culture that if you go for that, you're going to win, I think rests on a very questionable empirical assumption, let alone normative assumption. Yes, please.
Thank you. I came here tonight. We're working stiff down at Nationwide, and I come to talks like this to learn new things. And I'm walking out of here tonight knowing more about populism than I would ever be able to learn on my own. So thank you for a very stimulating talk. Toward the end, you said something that got me wondering, and I wonder if you can comment on what I was wondering. And you said, in the example of even the Trump case, he was a candidate of an established party. So what I'm wondering is, in the context of U.S. politics today, where, from my point of view, it's deeply divided, it's very partisan, it's no holds barred in the public square anymore. If going forward, there's a possibility that on both sides of the aisle, we might see more and more populist candidates backed by established parties who will use that populist thread to get elected and then see what happens. So I'm kind of wondering, going forward, will we see more populist candidates from established parties?
Thank you. Also, thank you for the kind words. I have to confess that the rhetorical structure of your remark initially suggested I usually come here and learn something, but tonight I don't learn anything. I knew all these things already. So thank you for being so generous. So three quick points in response to this. Yeah, of course, you're absolutely right that it's a deeply divided country. But I think it's worth spending a minute on how exactly we try to describe or analyze these divisions. Because sometimes people talk as if division in and of itself, or even polarization in and of itself, was not necessarily a terrible thing. But democracy, in a sense, exists to help us deal with differences and divisions. It's not about consensus. It's not something where everybody has to agree. And there's a difference between even quite polarized views where people recognize the legitimacy of the other side, and a situation where the real problem is the other side is basically illegitimate, unelectable, demonic even to some degree. Because surely one at least somewhat plausible explanation of what otherwise is a very puzzling phenomenon, namely the fact that at least some citizens on November 8th, 2016 said, he's not qualified to be president, I just voted for him, has to do with the sense that, well, under no circumstances can you vote for the other side. So I think it's not that division in and of itself is the problem. It's a particular kind of division. And that maybe invites a further thought that yes, there are deep cultural differences. Nobody needs, I don't need to come here to lecture you on those. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to treat these as if they were basically God-given. And this is just the culture, okay? This is just, well, whatever cliches then come up. Flyover country versus bi-coastal elites, all this sort of stuff. And I think what that leaves out is that in the last couple of decades, turned out that all polarization is also big business. And a lot of what, people might be tempted to see as natural and given, and that's just the way things are now, has to do with specific structures. And again, the point about the media, the fact that, you can make a lot of money dividing people in a way that maybe wasn't true a couple of decades in the past. So just a note of caution of sort of how we think about this. Now to your actual question, I have no remotely interesting predictions about what dynamics we're exactly going to see. I think it's a reasonable assumption that people will say yes, this is kind of working, and we'll try similar strategies. But in a certain way, what I would, if anything, find somewhat more plausible, but not less worrying as an outcome, and I think we actually do some indications of this, see some indications of this, is that on the one hand, we're going to have populists who think this is the winning strategy. But on the other side, we're going to have people who say, populists, we have to reject them completely. Demagogues, liars, we have the truth. Remember all these websites, you click on them today, immediately something pops up that says, if you care about the truth, subscribe today. Plus the truth is 40% cheaper today. It's this kind of attitude which says, okay, the other side is by definition, empirically wrong, and we are the ones who also have the reasonable, rational solutions. I think this potentially plays into a fateful dynamic where on the one hand, to put it crudely, but I think not inaccurately, we're going to have a form of technocracy. Where basically people say, here are rational solutions. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. No need for debate. And on the other side, we're going to have populists who on one level then rightly say, what do you mean democracy without debate and choices? Where are the people in all this? If they win, the technocrats are going to be even more confirmed in their technocracy, and they're going to say, look, people just vote for crazy candidates. Ideally, we take even more decisions away from them. So this becomes a kind of vicious circle where these two extremes, in a certain way, actually encourage each other, and maybe less obviously and more disturbingly still, even though they look so different, like extremes, they do share one important characteristic, because they're both forms of anti-pluralism. Technocrat basically says only one rational solution. You disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. Populist says only one authentic popular will. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be un-American, a traitor to the Polish people, as Kaczynski puts it, and so on and so forth. And anything that we might want to think of as democracy in terms of debate, exchange of arguments, choices, that disappears then between these two extremes. So I would be more worried about that scenario as opposed to the idea that now everybody is sort of going to go populist in one form or another. Yes?
Yeah, so here is a Russian perspective on that. So I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I've seen a lot of pluralism in the way people were thinking, right, underneath the official. There was actually ineffective government that wasn't morally and intellectually influencing the people. But now the same intellectual people are very much influenced by this very sophisticated propaganda that you talked about, right? So the question based on that experience is that whether the development of all this mass media very powerful tools that are also learning from each other very efficiently, isn't it always playing towards pluralism, towards the populism, simply because it's much harder to, so on one side you would think it should go the other way, right, because all of this information available everywhere online in such major quantities that people never were able to access before. But despite of this excess of information, the people think in a more uniform way and tend to fall into this populism in much more easier way. And isn't that the reason for the rise of the populism, right? That it's so much easier to use mass media to affect people to think one way rather than, right? It takes generations of educated people to raise people who can think independently and have their opinions and be available for pluralism and accept other points of view. And it's so much simpler to use mass media to stamp opinions on people. So is it inevitable that the rise of mass technology leads to populism?
As a cliched phrase goes, only death and taxes are inevitable. Everything else remains to a certain degree up to us, I think. But we're only taking, I think, the first steps in trying to understand the particular dynamics. It's very tempting, of course, to despair on the basis of an image of a golden age when, you know, there wasn't as much partisanship and people trusted journalists and so on. But at least in a number of countries I can think of, this is clearly false. I mean, people were divided according to which party they belonged to. They read the party newspaper. It was not that people, you know, with an open mind every morning said, so let's really understand what's going on. Let's listen to a wide plurality of voices, you know, to make sense of global politics. Clearly not. So what exactly might be the issue today, beyond some of the specifics I was trying to make plausible in terms of this direct connection, which I think in a previous age was much more difficult to make plausible. And I think my suggestion, but it's really just a suggestion, is to argue that yes, fake news is real. At the same time, it's not that important. I think a number of empirical studies have by now shown that yes, this does affect some people, but the idea that now, you know, masses and masses of citizens are basically ready to enter the world of post-truth and post-factual, I think actually just confirms a certain kind of elitist view of the people, of the great unwashed that certain individuals always had, and that is now nicely confirmed in a certain way. It is much more the kind of selection, the bias, but not the outright lie that is an issue. And then I think the real question is not so much about the technology or a kind of determinism of technology, but more a fundamental question of who do you trust? To whom do you attribute a certain kind of authority such that if that person or institution says it's like this and not like that, it basically closes the debate. And I think there are some countries, including this one, but it's not inevitable because there are plenty of countries where this has not happened, where this question of who makes that call has become much more problematic. And you just need to look at surveys, for instance, when people are asked, who do you trust? So in the UK, interestingly, even though it's always, you know, exhibit A for, you know, the first great populist triumph with Brexit, okay, who do people trust the most in the UK? Number one, nurses. Number two, doctors. But actually, journalists, God forbid even professors, are actually sort of still at the top, right? And politicians are at the bottom. But it's not true that, you know, everybody has decided that, you know, this is all, basically all professions, it's all rigged, you know, it's all these all fake credentials. I shouldn't give any authority to doctors, lawyers, journalists, and so on. So I think that's the place where to look, which is to say I don't have a, you know, very clear causal story I could tell you about this, but I think it's important to kind of really see more closely what exactly has eroded and what has changed. And I don't think there's anything determined. I don't think that people are now rushing out there to believe in crazy stuff about, you know, child pornography rings and pizzerias and so on and so forth. So that's not much of an answer, but I think it's maybe the beginning of how to phrase certain questions in a way where eventually, with the help of our colleagues in social science and other areas, we might have a certain set of answers. Yes.
So first of all, thank you for your excellent talk, which was very clarifying. You really elucidate, you know, what is happening, and I think that's very helpful to understand what's happening and think about how to deal with it. You know, as a liberal Democrat, I am just distressed at what's going on in this country, and the type of candidate who became elected, who I never thought I would see become elected here, but has, obviously. And so I have to think about this in terms of how do we beat this? How do we stop this? How do we change this? And I just wonder, if you look historically, there have been populists throughout history, no doubt, in this country and other countries. Are there times when they fail? What are the moments at which, you know, the story they're telling comes apart, and how does it come apart? And are there any lessons we can learn from history about how populists fail?
Thank you for the question. You're really not going to like this answer. I don't think there are any lessons that we could take out of this room for two reasons. One is that the world has changed. We have now, to go back to a point I keep harping on about, a changed infrastructure of democracy. So not just the institutions, which obviously in many ways haven't changed, but the infrastructure around to do with let's say, media, the media landscape as the most obvious example. And the other reason, and we kind of discussed it a little bit earlier on, is that yes, we can learn lessons, but they're learning lessons too. They also know history. You know, they're not as naive as to think that, okay, you know, sure, I'll have my script ready to repeat, you know, whatever you think needs to be repeated from the 20s or the 30s and so on. They also, in a sense, will have some sense, if they are clever. I'm not saying they're all clever, but those who really are skillful and savvy politicians, they also know how to avoid certain traps. And they've learned from, I think, previous failures of others, which is not to say they're invincible or nothing can be done, but I think, dare I say, there has been a very strong tendency, especially in the last couple of months or so, you know, one book after the other is rolling off the presses, giving us, you know, the wonderfully prepackaged, you know, lessons, which then will solve all this, and I just don't think that's going to be plausible. But to give you at least one thing that's a little bit more positive than this, I think one thing that is maybe important to bear in mind, and I think it's conversely a mistake that I think many oppositions have made in these contexts, is the following. Of course, it's their job as an opposition to be against the government. And if, you know, government does something that you think is wrong as a policy, be it for instrumental reasons or moral reasons, you obviously want to say that. That's just the job of the opposition. At the same time, I think it's important that sometimes you find a way of showing to people that, look, this is basically normal democratic conflict, okay? And over here now, something else is going on. This touches our most basic constitutional principles. And to find a way of telling that story in such a way that even people who disagree with you politically on all these policy questions might hopefully sometimes be able to say, yeah, I can see that this is now about the bigger picture. And I think, I mean, maybe you see it differently, but I think there's been a tendency among many opposition parties, including the Democrats in this country, to basically, it all becomes sort of one sound, where, you know, opposition to gutting the Affordable Care Act is sort of just another thing that goes along with, you can't really tweet about people and call them so-called judges, you can't really tweet about people and say whoever is against my travel ban is a paid-up activist, because these things are in a different category. And again, this can sound slightly naive, but I think if one is at all able to get into a conversation with, in a sense, your partisan opponents, I think one has to do whatever one can to say, look, would you want to be in a position where basically, you know, the other side wins, and then this is done to you, that basically your legitimacy is totally denied, you're basically ruled out of the game? That, I think, is an important red line to kind of try to make as visible as possible.
Having very much enjoyed your presentation tonight, I want to turn it maybe a little round a little bit. The presentation in presenting populism is that it's like this venomous snake bite to liberal pluralism. And what's the antidote? And I think that to turn it a little differently, democracies, we know, are very fragile. If you look at history, we know they don't last long. And so my question is, when you look at what's going on today with the current populism, is the idea of the liberal pluralism or democracy, is the life force gone away? Is the life force of that idea spent such that it may go away? I'll leave it at that. That's the question: is can we survive? You know, not just popular. Can we survive it? Are we strong enough to survive it? And there was talk about learning from history. I think the popular quote from history I heard, I love this one because it really captures today, is all you need to know about history is nobody learns from it. Never forget that.
That's even better than the famous line from James Bryce that the chief use of history is to basically, you know, turn us away from plausible sounding historical analogies. Mm-hmm. So I completely agree with your sentiment, but for what it's worth, no, I don't think the life force of democracies is spent. Sometimes nowadays you read sort of people who say surveys show that people might be more inclined towards authoritarianism. I think a lot of that evidence is somewhat dubious. And at a basic level, it still matters that most actors, certainly most actors outside the world's most populous country, well, okay, officially want to be seen as Democrats. That's very different from the 20s and 30s, where people said, look, let's be done with liberal democracy and your parliaments, basically just talking shops, we have better solutions. It doesn't mean that all these people really are Democrats. I hope that's become somewhat clearer tonight. But it also matters that they want to be seen that way, and that basically there is not some sort of great rival ideology on the shelf that now millions of people are going to flock and take off. So therefore also very different from the Cold War, where in a sense you had very, very distinct rival ideologies. So in that sense, I think one should not assume that people are just tired of democracy or they're desperate to move on to something else.
Where are the flames that are going to break out into the fire that make it strong again? Where do you see that there is that energy that is ready to break back out?
I don't even mind if democracy on certain days is a lukewarm bath. It doesn't have to be everybody fired up the whole time. People, of course, in certain critical moments need to be willing to kind of go out there and do certain things. I completely agree with you. But I just don't see it at the level of mentalities that people have really said, oh, we'd rather be done with this. The whole system doesn't sort of deliver anything for us anymore. Which is not to say there are no problems or that people who have, as the phrase goes, grievances are somehow confused and wrong. But I think instead of, in a sense, too quickly, from my point of view, jumping to the 30s analogy, or to say, now it's a matter of life and death, I think other actors, in a sense, have actually, in a certain way, a more difficult task. Because if it's simply a matter of saying, look, populists are basically just fascists, it's alarming, but it also makes things very easy, in a certain way. Now we know. Now we have certainty. I think it's a much more difficult job for a politician nowadays to say, look, not all the people who voted for populist parties have really said bye-bye to democracy. But how do we kind of appeal to them in such a way that, not that all their grievances are validated, but that they feel that their conflicts can be dealt with. And the thought here is that sometimes it's actually non-populist actors who have a very demanding task of basically finding ways of recoding conflicts in such a way that they don't all come down to culture war. Because if we leave it to the populists, they're going to say every conflict, immigration, economic policy, climate, everything is ultimately going to be about identity and culture war. And I think that's a bad outcome. So the job of the others then is also to say, look, there is a real conflict here, okay? That's what I was trying to say earlier. You can have a democratic debate about immigration, but it's a question of how you set it up. And if you set it up, I think, in the wrong way, it plays into the hands of the populists. But this is I think, a very demanding task. I'm not sure I could do that for sure. So it's a much more tricky sort of call for political judgment, where you don't make it too easy for yourself by saying, oh, they're all just fascists, and you kind of take a responsibility for the long-term, if you like, health of a democratic political culture by saying, look, this is how we should restructure these things in such a way that not everything comes down to a corrupt elite versus virtuous people. And then, yeah, there's still going to be losers. Democracy is not about everybody winning. That's not the promise. The promise is everybody is going to have a chance to make their case. And everybody is also going to have a chance to make their case in such a way that others can kind of deal with these conflicts and potentially be persuaded by the claims outside this fateful populist image of, oh, everything's always going to be about the corrupt elite and the morally pure people. So I'm sorry I didn't rekindle the fire, but that's the best I can do. Yes, sir.
First off, thank you for the talk and being so succinct and clear with addressing the problem. I think I kind of connected with what you just said there, and so I want to ask about like sort of the idea of moving towards authoritarianism and rejection of democracy with a populist movement, but more focus on like the performance and then the outcome. So how much of this is performing then authoritarian sort of style, and how much of that is actually behind that?
it's a very good, which is to say, very difficult question. So I think it's precise. Some of the people who've been quote unquote successful with their populism business model, if you like, I think have exactly been able to, on the one hand, say, we are Democrats, or sometimes even we are the better Democrats, because we have referenda and we have national consultations and, we actually listen to what people really want. And at the same time also, of course, making it clear that they're not like the other Democratic politicians, somehow. And sometimes, of course, this has then played out as a performance of certain strongman aesthetics, if you like, which in and of itself is a difficult question as to the extent to which you might say this is always illegitimate under all circumstances. But if you say that, then I think somebody's immediately going to throw back at you, what about FDR under certain circumstances? What about other leaders who, are very strongly asserting as a mandate? So it gets very tricky. And maybe one thing that, again, in a more negative roundabout way might be helpful is to not assume that just because these actors are successful, therefore they must have a genuine charisma. That happens very often, because conceptually, people sort of immediately tie populism to charismatic leader. And I think this goes back actually to historical memories and lessons where people tend to assume, well, a populist is basically somebody who stands with a half-open shirt on a balcony in Buenos Aires, and here are the irrational masses, applauding him and sometimes her. Of course, it helps to have a charismatic leader. That's good for every party, every movement. But the kind of conclusion which I sometimes hear that, because this populist movement or party is successful, therefore the leader must be charismatic, that doesn't really follow. Now, we can debate what charisma really is. None of us, I think, can quantify in any meaningful way, whether you have it or you don't. But with all due respect, someone like, Heinz Christian Strache, the leader of the Freedom Party in Austria, I don't think he's charismatic. I also even don't think that Marine Le Pen is charismatic, even though she is obviously on one level an extremely skillful politician and very successful, partly because of that. But I think, in a sense, also to kind of keep things in perspective, we should not fall for this sort of journalistic line that, if it's populism, they must have this extra charisma somehow, and that already puts us even more on the defensive, because they might have it and we don't. So again, that didn't quite maybe answer your question, but put another thought out there in terms of how to at least shy away from what very often nowadays is suggested to us in newspaper articles, sort of media analyses. And this is a very subtle reminder that time is up, no?
But remember, we do have a reception immediately following this, and you'll have a chance to talk to Professor Müller at the reception there. Please join us for that. And join me in thanking Professor Müller for a really terrific